Okay, today I am doing the 90s kid tag. I had seen this go around a couple times over the past few years, and I saw that it was going around again, and I thought it would be fun. The 90s basically encompassed my entire teen years, and this is actually what I looked like in the 90s. Right there. That was me right here. So I have multiple answers actually for a lot of these questions because they spanned from when I was younger to when I was older. So I obviously had different interests, at the beginning and at the end of the 90s. So let's get started. The first question is, what is your favorite TV show? And that actually changed, like I said, from the early 90s when I was younger to later. So I couldn't pinpoint one favorite show of the 90s. In the early 90s, I watched all the Nickelodeon stuff. Clarissa Explains It All was probably my number one favorite of the Nickelodeon shows in the early 90s. I also watched Hey Dude, Are You Afraid of the Dark, that whole block that they had. Welcome Freshmen, Salute Your Shorts. There was also a show, it was from Canada, and it was kind of like Degrassi or Edgemont. I think it was called Hillside, but it was called 15 on Nickelodeon, and I loved that show. I think it was called Hillside, but I will put it right here, what it actually is. And I loved that show. And then in the later 90s, My So-Called Life, obviously. That is like the 90s TV show, even though it was so short, but I loved it. And I also watched a lot of, I think maybe the first couple seasons of Buffy were in the 90s, and I watched that. I also watched Dawson's Creek, and then I really got into soap operas in the 90s, so I watched General Hospital at that time. I also watched Days of Our Lives, and I think even Passions started in 99. So I did watch Passions. I watched Port Charles. I think that was in the 90s as well. And then I also got into anime in the 90s. So thinking back that far, Project A-ko was probably one of my favorites. And if you ever watched anime in the 90s, you know the struggle of finding anime on VHS, $30 a VHS for 2 episodes. Yeah. And question number 2 is, what was your favorite toy? I didn't have a favorite toy per se. I had grown out of most of the toys by the time the 90s had happened, but I did love dolls. So I had, like a lot of people, the American Girl dolls. When I first got the American Girl doll, there were actually only 3 of them. Molly, Kirsten, and Samantha. I had Samantha because she was fancy, and I loved her stuff. And I actually collected that stuff for I got birthday and Christmas. That was what I wanted for quite a few years. So I had the bed and the birthday set and all that kind of thing. And I even collected dolls much later just because I like them. But I like creepy children looking things. Okay, number 3 is, what is your favorite commercial? My favorite commercial of the 90s was the Volkswagen Jetta, I think it was. And it had that song that goes, da, da, da. And it's an actual real song. I think it's by the band Yellow. It's an 80s song. It's an actual real song. But it's where they're driving around in their car and they see a chair on the side of the road and they pick it up and they put it in their car and they're driving around, and then it's I don't know, they smell it or something. So then you see them driving away and it's sitting on the curb again. If I can find that commercial, I will link it below. That is like probably one of my favorite commercials. Number 4, NSYNC or Backstreet Boys. New Kids on the Block. Sorry. It's gotta be New Kids on the Block. They were around in the 90s. I think their Christmas album came out right before 1990. So obviously you were listening to that into the new year. But Step by Step, that one came out in the middle of, I think, 1990 or 91 or something like that. But in truth, I was a little old in my mind for NSYNC and Backstreet Boys when they came out. It was one of those things that they were both really catchy, and I guess I would have to say I would pick Backstreet Boys over NSYNC at the time. Now when I listen to them, I really actually kind of appreciate NSYNC more, but at the time I probably would have picked Backstreet Boys. But that was the kind of thing that you listen to with your windows rolled up on the radio, so you could just say if somebody heard it, oh, it was just on the radio, I was about to change it, because it was uncool. Number 5 is the weirdest fashion trend. Oh geez. There were so many. The trend that I loved was the baby doll dresses and combat boots. I loved that. The one that I did not love as much was the wide-leg pants. If I think back to when I was like in junior high in the earlier 90s, tracksuits were big. At least here they were. I don't know if they were all over the place, but tracksuits, which were the worst thing ever when I think about them now. Hypercolor. That was kind of fun. I wore flannel and plaid a lot. And I also wore, let's see, the little short skirts and like knee-high socks. I did that, like the Clueless type of look. I hated the big sweater and overall things because it made everyone look like they were like 3 times bigger than they actually were. Number 6 is my favorite collectible. I didn't really collect anything major in the 90s. I did collect dolls. And that was probably about it. I have a bunch of dolls. Okay, number 7 is, which is your favorite Beanie Baby? I never got into Beanie Babies. I have a few. My dad gave me a purple platypus. And then, I don't even, it was probably after the 90s, but I have a cute little bat one that I saw when the mall did like collector show thing. I got that there, but I think that was actually after the 90s, and it was only because I thought it was cute. So, yeah, not into Beanie Babies. Number 8, how many Tamagotchis did you go through? I never actually had Tamagotchi, but I did work at Spencer's for a summer, and they had this thing that was just like Tamagotchi called Nano Pet, and I got one of those, and I used it for basically the 3 months that I worked there, and then never touched it again. Okay, number 9 is my favorite console and game. I actually didn't have many consoles in the 90s. I have like all of them now, but my parents were not big on that kind of thing. So we had a Sega Genesis, a Game Boy, and then a PlayStation 1. I think, yeah, that was in the 90s, pretty sure. So on the Genesis, my favorite game was called Hunting starring Poltergeist, where you had to go around and scare people. And I don't really have a favorite game on the Game Boy. Like by that time I had actually kind of quit using that. My favorite game on PlayStation 1 in the 90s was Bust a Groove, which was a rhythm game where you dance and you're basically fighting the opponent off to the side. And then I got into RPGs, but that actually wasn't until a little bit later. I also had a computer that whole time, And aside from the BBS games that were just like those little games that you played online on local bulletin boards, I played things like The Seventh Guest and that kind of game. Those were more my sister's kind of games, but I did play them a little bit. But yeah, in the 90s though, wasn't a huge gamer. Number 10 is what is my favorite Disney movie? And I'm going to shock and horrify everyone and say, I am not a big Disney person. I don't like a lot of the Disney movies that much. I mean, they're fine movies, I guess, but I don't love any of them. So there are some exceptions. The 90s movies were better than the 80s, like Animal all the time, like death stories that they tended to do. But I would say The Little Mermaid and The Lion King were the two Disney movies of the 90s that I liked. 11 is what was your favorite musical artist? And I would say as a band, probably my favorite was Garbage. I listen to a lot of different types of music though, especially if you span the entire decade. I love 90s R&B. I love gangster rap. I love 90s club music. Most of what I listened to was the grunge and alternative kind of stuff. Basically, if you have Sirius XM and turn on Lithium, that's basically what I listen to most. Specifically, I liked Garbage, obviously, Hole, No Doubt, Soundgarden, Stabbing Westward, Veruca Salt, a bunch of other stuff. One of my favorite alternative bands was Switchblade Symphony. That was kind of an electronica goth kind of thing. I basically listen to most types of music except for country because I hate country. And I just could never get into the hippie thing, like the Grateful Dead and all that kind of stuff that went around. Number 12 is what was your favorite Nickelodeon show? And out of the entire thing, I'm going to pick Clarissa Explains It All. I wanted to be like her so much. The computer games, the clothes, I wanted that so much. Number 13, what was your favorite candy? Pixie sticks. I loved pixie sticks. I ate them all the time. And I would even get like those massive pixie sticks that are like, you know, like this long and like this thick plastic tubing. I had those too. Number 14, what was your favorite game to play? I am not a game person. I don't really like board games. I was forced to play a couple of them, like Balderdash. I think the one that's kind of like charades, whatever that one is. But I even tried playing D&D once, and I just couldn't get into it. Yeah, I mean, I liked computer games. I liked video games, but I didn't really like actually playing like board games and stuff like that. Number 15, what were your favorite books? This also is one of those things that varied over the course of the time. Like when I was younger in the 90s, I was getting out of things like Babysitter's Club and stuff like that, and I was moving on to R.L. Stine. Not Goosebumps. Goosebumps were actually a little bit later, and I was too old for those. Because I was already like past even Fear Street at that point. But I did read Fear Street, and my favorite ones were the Cheerleaders books. And I actually have those. I found those on like eBay so I could get those again. And there was actually a fifth one, and I had no idea. And I just found it, and I just bought it. So I like Christopher Pike more than R.L. Stine. And my favorites from him were Witch, the Final Friends trilogy, and Last Act. What I really liked about his, at least in the beginning, was they were not supernatural. They were like murder stuff like that. And then my all-time favorite of like my earlier years, and I even read her actually well after my reading level was beyond her books, was L.J. Smith. And my favorite of L.J. Smith, she did the Vampire Diaries books, the Secret Circle books, both of which they made into TV shows. The Forbidden Game was actually my favorite. The first volume of The Forbidden Game was probably my favorite book from her of the entirety of what she wrote. Dark Visions I also really liked. And then Night World was okay. They were just a lot shorter. And she never finished it. And it looks like she's never going to finish it. But then young adult wasn't what it is now, so I actually transitioned into adult books by about 15. So I read all Anne Rice, like all the Vampire Anne Rice books. My actual very first purchase on Amazon in 1998 was The Vampire Armand. I actually went back and looked because I saw a BuzzFeed video was what was your first Amazon purchase. So I actually wanted to see what mine was. And it was The Vampire Armand from Anne Rice. And then my ultimate favorite book is called What's Wrong with Tamara. It was like a horror book. I loved the horror genre that was around in the 90s. And it was actually the second book. I found the first book online. If you ever tried to buy used online back in the 90s, it was something special. Number 16, what was your favorite clothing store? Probably my favorite clothing store was Gadzooks and Wet Seal. And I know Hot Topic existed. It wasn't as prevalent, so we didn't have one here, but they had one about 3 or so hours away. So when I was older and could go by myself, I would go there. And it was totally different from what it is now. It was all like punk and goth clothing, and I loved it. And number 17, what did you watch when you got home? Honestly, I have no clue. I don't know that I watched a lot of TV like that, but probably it was MTV. Whatever was on MTV, because they actually played music. And that is it for the 90s kid tag. That was actually kind of fun. I hadn't thought about a lot of those things in a long time, especially things like Nano-Pets and Tomagotchi and stuff like that. If you haven't checked out my last video, I'll have it linked to the side, and also my Project Pan Roulette, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye!